Chapter 4 Images of the Magician in Myth and History. It used to be that we pointed to our cultural heritage as being one of the things that made us unique among animals. Other animals were unable, we argued, to create and transmit a culture. Their habits were solely attributable to instinct. But this criterion has fallen in recent years, along with so many of our other measures of our own uniqueness. Contemporary Japanese monkeys have achieved what can only be described as a cultural breakthrough. Careful observers noted a number of years ago a single female making a major advance in food preparation. She came up with the idea of washing her food in the ocean before eating. After her discovery, she was seen instructing other members of the tribe in this new technique. Soon, monkeys on other Japanese islands were doing the same thing. Far to the west, African chimpanzees have been seen to strip the leaves from stems, then dip the stems into termite mounds in order to extract the insects. The termites are a chimpanzee delicacy. The young eagerly watch their mother's technique and soon begin to experiment themselves. Some ancestral chimp obviously thought of using the stem tool and implemented the new technology. And his tasty cultural innovation was then passed on to succeeding generations. Language use and transmission has been argued to be another gift unique to humans. But chimpanzees, although they lack the biological equipment necessary to use verbal language, have been taught by humans to use sign language. Some of these chimps have been seen teaching this form of communication to their young. They even have the ability to create language. One chimp, on seeing ducks on a pond for the first time, excitedly signed water and bird, thus creating the word waterbird, a description that was exactly correct. If the magician is the archetype of the knower and the technologist of power, his energy is demonstrably present in at least some of the other primates. He probably arose in the psyche of our species in a very remote pre-human past. The Lascaux caves of southern France offer the earliest known tangible evidence of human psychospirituality. They are filled with lush, vibrant representations of the animals that filled the imaginations of the Paleolithic hunters. The care with which these magnificent beasts are rendered gives us some hint of the psychological and spiritual relationship our distant ancestors felt they had with them. Many scholars have interpreted the caves as sanctuaries dedicated to masculine rites of initiation. Certainly, the majority of the painted figures illustrate masculine concerns, and the few human beings represented are almost always men. Some are the shamanistic birdmen we described in the introduction. However, as Riane Eisler rightly points out in her book, The Chalice and the Blade, figurines of what appears to be a mother goddess also abound in these caves. She raises the question of just how exclusively these caves were devoted to male interest. But she minimizes unnecessarily the clear evidence that the caves were used by a male hunting culture headed by a male shaman. If we add to the evidence the caves offer us the circumstantial evidence that the primary deity is male in most primitive cultures even to this day, from the Australian Aborigines to most African tribes, then we will not make the mistake of undervaluing the role of a masculine god in the old Stone Age religion. It seems perfectly plausible to imagine that Paleolithic peoples understood that both masculine and feminine principles were essential for the realization of abundance and fertility in the human and natural worlds. We may suppose a remote, invisible sky father played an important role in the early religion, beside a visible, tangible earth mother. She was represented in concrete form because her earthly realm was also palpable. He was represented only by hints and signs, because of the dangers inherent in rendering the ineffable. And perhaps the clay figures of the mother goddess were used to teach the boys the secrets of sexuality. It would be no surprise to see an earth mother present in ceremonies held by the ancient hunters. Ancient shamanic consciousness might understand the cave sanctuaries as the womb and birth canal of Mother Earth, and use them as sanctuaries for the initiation of boys into manhood, a process by which the boys are essentially reborn from the Earth's womb. When we turn to primitive societies that have survived into the modern era, we see an abundant evidence of magician energy. From the African savannas to the rainforests of Brazil, from northern snow-blanketed Asia to Australia's deserts, everywhere we look we see shamans, magicians, rainmakers, and medicine men. Their functions are more or less the same, though one culture's emphasis may be on engineering fertility and another's on helping dead spirits move confidently into afterlife. What is remarkable is the universality of shamanic phenomena as an expression of the magician archetype. In one way or another, the magician has everywhere inspired our species to journey within, reflect, conserve, and create. He has taught us to guide and steward our precious psychic energy in order to ensure harmony within ourselves and without in nature. Historic magicians. The first historical example we have of the embodied magician is that of the ancient Egyptian vizier Imhotep, circa 2800 BC. Chief counsel to Djoser, a second dynasty pharaoh, Imhotep was a powerful healer and physician. His medical innovations were so staggering to ancient peoples that he eventually was deified. The Greeks knew him as the god Asclepios. Imhotep was, besides being the greatest healer of his era, the architect of sacred space and time. He designed King Djoser's magnificent city of the dead at Saqqara on the Nile's west bank, and oversaw the building. Here was built a miniature city, complete with storehouses, house-like tombs, a racecourse, and paved streets, all centered around the first fully developed pyramid tomb of the ancient world. This astounding achievement in monumental architecture was completely covered in gleaming white limestone and surrounded by a beautifully appointed wall. The Saqqara complex was sacred as a microscopic representation of the universe. Within its precincts, death has returned to life. King Djoser ran here his periodic Heb-Sed race to demonstrate his continuing vigor, and thus his fitness to continue his kingship. He was reinvigorated at the same time by accompanying magic rituals. After his death, Djoser was laid to rest in the pyramid, a limestone representation of the rays of the sun, the Egyptian stairway to heaven. At the sacred time of renewal, Imhotep affirmed his power to transform the pharaoh's mummy into spirit. Imhotep was not alone in working the feats of magic that created civilization. Every ancient civilization had its wizards and sorcerers, its astrologers, astronomers, philosophers, and theologians, its metallurgists, architects, chemists, and physicians, and physicists. Egyptian literature abounds with short stories that celebrate the exploits of famed magicians. Babylonian wizards were known far and wide. The Persian magi later completely transformed the cultures and religions of the entire Near East. Their impact on the worlds of Greece and Rome was profound, and through that channel they have influenced all subsequent flowering of Western civilization. The Bible's Samuel, Elijah, and Elisha are all shamanic figures. After their miraculous births, they hear an inner voice they identify as Yahweh or Elohim. They perform great feats of magic, calling fire down from an empty sky, for example, or raising the dead, and their deaths are occasions of great mystery. In Elijah's case, he was lifted bodily into the heavens in a fiery chariot. The biblical prophets were likewise inspired by magician energy, which offered remarkable insight into human nature, the contemporary world situation, and perhaps even the future. Like others in the shamanic tradition, they recorded much of their oracular material in metered verse. Jesus is the greatest biblical magician of all. Though not part of the canonical tradition, there are stories of the boy Jesus making clay birds and transforming them into real birds, which flew off praising their Creator. As an adult, he multiplied loaves and fishes, turned water into wine, healed the sick, calmed storms, walked on water, drove demons out of people, and even raised the dead to life. He passed on a reinterpreted mythological heritage of his people, as shamans often do. And his parables, while not poetry by conventional standards, were certainly lyrical in composition and content. In the end, he performed the greatest disappearing act in history, leaving his tomb empty for the generations to ponder. Like many shamans, he took the illnesses of his people upon himself and was killed because of his self-sacrificial efforts. And then, like many magicians before him, he was deified. In the Greek mystery religions, the magician-guided initiatory process became the central theme. Men and women of all ages were brought face to face with the deep mysteries of life and death in secret rites honoring Demeter, the earth goddess. Forced to face their own mortality, initiates achieved a wiser, more profound maturity. They were sobered and enlivened through exposure to the mechanisms of the human psyche. Though the initiated were sworn to secrecy, Plutarch left a limited account of the proceedings behind him. Without knowing the specifics of the ceremony, we do know this much. Quote, "The candidates were made to roam through winding subterranean passages. It was a peregrination through the dark, a journey to an invisible end, which put to the test all one's presence of mind. And then, at the moment of decision, the initiates were subjected to terrors. They experienced shudders and trembling, they sweated with fear and were paralyzed with terror, until light was gradually admitted and the day restored. With sacred chants and dancing choruses, a magnificent place opened before them. The initiated was crowned with garlands, and by the side of pure and holy men, he enjoyed the festival of rebirth." Unquote. We find here again the use of an underground journey as a symbol for rebirth out of the earth's womb. Caves are used so often in initiation practices throughout the world, it would seem the metaphor of cave as womb is an archetypal one. Initiation is a matter of dying to an outmoded ego structure, so that a wiser one can be formed. Luckily for the Greeks, their mystery rites were stewarded by ritual elders who worked carefully to pass their wisdom on. The magician is on intimate terms with death. He is the guide of souls. As the shaman, he is the rescuer of lost souls. He also knows the deep secret, hidden at the wellspring of all things, that out of death comes life, renewed, transformed, and triumphant. Beginning at the time of Christ and continuing for the next several centuries, a Christian movement known as Gnosticism developed from earlier Hermetic traditions. Hermes had been a Greek god, the conductor of souls. Signposts along a road were once known as herms. Gnostic texts rest on the conviction that matter is evil, and emancipation is attainable only through knowledge, or gnosis. In their reliance on a purely mental means of salvation, Gnostics show themselves powerfully influenced by the magician. Their sacred texts rely upon a deep introversion, a profound self-reflection, and a conviction that enlightenment lies within. Jung thought of the Gnostics as forerunners of modern depth psychology. The Catholic Church persecuted adherents of the Gnostic faith until their traditions disappeared. However, their ideas resurfaced from time to time in the heresies of the European Middle Ages. Some scholars argue for an unbroken Gnostic tradition, kept alive through the efforts of individuals passing books and practices down through the centuries. Periodically, these scholars argue the teachings reached a larger audience and full-scale movements, such as the Albigensian heresy, developed out of them. Others note the similarities between various heretical outbreaks, but argue that they occurred in isolation from one another. What was similar was the archetypal forces behind the heresies, and not the heresies themselves. Regardless of which history is true, the magician energy was clearly an important part of these underground movements. The magician also played an important role in the occult traditions, which continued to be secretly practiced throughout European history. Eventually, the magician publicly directed the Church's emerging scholastic movement, and privately continued to influence the beliefs of the alchemists. The stories of Merlin, the legendary British wizard, offer a glimpse into the way the magician was venerated by the folk, but abhorred by the Church in medieval Europe. The Merlin stories present a composite figure drawn from the accounts of various Druidic shamans. The Druids were the priests of the Celtic pre-Christian religion, who survived more or less publicly for a time into the Christian era. They were the knowers of the mysterious powers of nature, the keepers of astronomical and astrological lore. Stonehenge was one of their shrines, built to mark and celebrate the seasons and the solstices, and the guardians of the forest and peoples of Britain and Gaul. Stonehenge was said to have been Merlin's project. A huge boundary of megaliths surrounds a sacred space, in whose center stands a stone altar. Another stone is situated in the perimeter, so that at dawn on the solstice, the sun's rays pass up along this stone and finally break over the top of it to illuminate the central altar. we can only imagine what kind of sacrifice or ceremony was performed on the altar at that powerful moment. Merlin was given credit for the conception of the shrine and for engineering the cutting, transportation, and erection of the stones. The enormous, impossibly heavy stones were quarried at a site far removed from Stonehenge and had to be transported across England on the ground, since there was no river between the two locations. Many different possible schemes have been proposed to account for the transportation of the stones. Legend has it, of course, that Merlin transported them magically. In the Arthurian legends, Merlin is credited as the genius behind Camelot, the English paradigm for paradise on earth. It was Merlin who brought design to the seasons and who inspired Arthur to bring law and order to his anarchic land, and introduced to his court the civilized customs of chivalry. Most tales of Camelot show a deep reverence for Merlin. Some versions of the story, though, give a harsher, Christian, and depreciating portrait of the old magician. In some, he appears to be an ineffectual, bumbling old fool, and in others he seems little better than a shadow magician, whose diabolical schemes devastate the kingdom. In T.H. White's beautiful, melancholy retellings of the Arthurian legends, Merlin appears alternately as a well-intentioned but absent-minded buffoon and an irritable, bitter old man. But Merlin still works his magic on our imaginations today, and the sacred perfection of Camelot still draws us to a vision of a sublime way of being human, inspired and guided by the powers of the magician. The alchemist relied very heavily on the magician's powers. While initially their interest was in finding a way to turn baser stuffs into gold, they very soon determined to effect also an inner integration. Their thinking was that they would be unable to successfully transform and purify metals until they had first transformed and purified themselves. They engaged in esoteric ceremonies learned from the Gnostics and the occultists, whose ultimate purpose was more focused on the integration of the various psychic entities encountered in the imaginal realm than on the furtherance of chemical science. They encountered the energy levels at the deepest layers of the psyche, where the power animals and spirits of the shamanic traditions reside, or the archetypes and complexes of modern psychology, and attempted to bring about the chemical wedding, a marriage of inner and outer opposites. Through this wedding, material gold emerges just as surely as the gold of the soul or self. One of the real chemical discoveries of the alchemists was due to this research into opposites. Some believed that potential gold would be found only in a materially opposite substance, and so Brandt, a Berger of Hamburg, died in 1692, made concerted efforts to investigate, separate, and distill the components of urine, discovering phosphorus in the process. The Jews of medieval Europe also took strength from the magician. The same energy that had once influenced their developing laws, customs, and theologies inspired them to continue the sciences of the Greek philosophers, which eventually led to the practices of the Kabbalah. As the Jewish Talmud was compiled, remarkable interpretive texts which were in themselves an outpouring of magician energy, there also arose an intricate and profound study of the human psyche. The Kabbalah, as this study became known, paralleled and surpassed the work of the Gnostics, the occultists, and the alchemists. In common with the Gnostics, the Kabbalists believed there to be tremendous inherent power in certain words and incantations. They believed the Old Testament was a symbolic text behind whose parables lay revelatory knowledge. Nothing was taken at face value. Everything referred to something beyond itself. This tradition probably grew from a cultural background of magical incantations, words that were believed to be so powerful in certain contexts that they could make things happen. Every passage in the Old Testament was believed to hold a code, which a subtle enough mind could detect. For the Kabbalists, salvation lay in tremendous intellectual effort. As had happened with alchemy, the Kabbalah led its adherents to an exploration of the hidden layers of the psyche. Whether or not their original foundation was a solid one, in their delineation and invocation of the 10 aspects of God, the Kabbalists were investigating for themselves the archetypes in the collective unconscious. Though ardently suppressed by the rationalizing rabbis of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Kabbalistic tradition persisted in Eastern Europe until the early days of the 20th century. For an excellent popular representation of this Jewish shamanic tradition as it had become at the turn of the century, see Isaac Bashevis Singer's story, The Magician, or the movie of the same name. Yoshi, who bears the same name as Jesus, Yeshua in Hebrew, is a stage magician at the opening of the movie. He yearns, like the Kabbalists, to know from God, as he says, how you do it. He wants to experience the divine magic of creation, of real transformation and recreation. Yoshi is also a would-be inventor. As we've seen, an interest in technology is another of the aspects of the magician. Yoshi spends his free time and his extra money trying to build and fly primitive airplanes. After a series of personal and professional disasters, Yoshi becomes an ascetic, bricking himself up in a hut from which there is no exit. He builds the stone hut around himself, leaving only a small window in one wall. Through this, he receives his meager meals and offers counsel and insight to those who come seeking his wisdom and healing. In the final, gripping scene, a woman and her son visit Yoshi. Believing themselves to have been wronged by him, they rain accusations down upon him. They incite some of the villagers to riot. The mob goes to work against Yoshi's hut. Block by block, it comes crashing down. Yoshi's wife and his friends try to intervene, but they are pushed out of the way. When the last wall of the hut is destroyed, amid the rubble, the mob finds no one. Yoshi has performed the greatest trick of all, one that harks back to the paintings in the Paleolithic caves. As the crowd stands in the ruins of his cell, a flock of wild geese flies overhead. One goose calls loudly, and Yoshi's wife looks heavenward, her face registering anguish and amazement. Like all good shamans, Yoshi has ascended into the heavens. He has become a birdman. He has realized his dream of flying through the spiritual technology of the soul. Native American cultures were replete with shamans. We are fortunate to have a record of one of the last great shamans of the Oglala Sayu, The now famous Black Elk. Black Elk felt he must find an interpreter to record and save his great vision for men. And he found him in John G. Neihart. Neihart presents a series of interviews with this great shaman, in which Black Elk tells of the course of his life and of the unfolding of the shamanic calling and consciousness within him. Black Elk relates his early illnesses and revelatory visions, which culminated in his great vision. In this vision, he saw revealed to him, among other things, the structure of the universe and the nature of divine beings. Through voices and visual hallucinations, he was commissioned as a shaman. The cosmic grandfathers, as Neihart records, handed Black Elk a wooden cup. Quote, "And it was full of water, and in the water was the sky. Take this," the grandfather said. "It is the power to make live, and it is yours. It is the power to make live, and it is yours." Now he had a bow in his hands. "Take this," he said. "It is the power to destroy, and it is yours." Black Elk, like every shaman and every mystic, came to see the most closely guarded secret of all. Quote, "I saw more than I can tell, and I understood more than I saw. For I was seeing in a sacred manner the shapes of all things in the spirit, and the shape of all shapes, as they must live together like one being. And I saw that the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that made one circle, wide as daylight and as starlight. And in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and father. And I saw that it was holy." Within a few years of Black Elk's great vision, in a wholly different cultural context, the magician energy surfaced in two new sciences that managed, between them, to completely overturn European assumptions about reality. Just as society finally absorbed the teachings of the materialistic scientist, which proclaimed that all there was to reality was contained in a three-dimensional spatio-temporal universe, work by the pioneers of depth psychology and subatomic physics demonstrated the opposite to be true. Their message was an ancient one every shaman, medicine man, and parlor magician has always known. Things are not at all what they seem. The new discoveries of subatomic physics revealed that the apparently solid material world is really a grand illusion, made up of energy fields and time-space warps in which wave particles and quanta of energy manifest transiently and for undiscoverable reasons. Einstein, perhaps the greatest magician in this magic show, demonstrated that time and space are aspects of the same phenomena, and that both are defined by movement. He proved time and space to be a flexible, malleable thing. His work led to colleagues' mathematically determined discoveries of the possibilities of other dimensions, wormholes, and black holes, and of other universes, perhaps millions of them, which flourish in expanding bubbles in a time-space very different from our own. Soon, the magicians were put to work at Los Alamos, running the cosmic clock backward billions of years in an effort to recreate the processes at work deep in the interior of stars. Robert Oppenheimer, their leader, was profoundly shaken as he witnessed the first atomic bomb detonated in the desert darkness. In that supernal flash of unthinkable light and heat, Oppenheimer recalled the lines of a shaman poet, one who had foreseen such an event in the depths of his inner wanderings. The shaman who had written the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God. Quote, "Time I am, the destroyer of worlds, and I have come to engage all people." During the same era, Sigmund Freud's researches into the inner world of the human psyche confirmed that not everything was as simple as it appeared to be. Freud was the first to pursue a systematic probing of the unconscious. The general public soon was fascinated to learn that motives are often not what they are claimed to be, and that the I, once thought of as a whole personality, is no more than the tip of an iceberg that extends far down into the layers of a soul as deep, dark, and mysterious as the ocean. Consciously or not, Freud took what was formerly an occult preserve dream interpretation and extended its means and its precision. He also divined the hidden meanings of the accidental things we say, accidents we now know as Freudian slips. As Freud explored the mysterious and regenerative world within, he became an adventurer, like the shaman, into the unseen dimensions of reality. He was the steward, in his analytic practice, of the sacred space and time of the subconscious. He became a kind of soul guide, like the ritual elder of a traditional society, one helping to initiate immature and fragmented human beings into adulthood. This modern magician, significantly, kept a statuette of the Egyptian Imhotep on his desk, to whom it is said he often talked. Perhaps it was from Imhotep that Freud heard the oracles that often inspired him. Freud's younger colleague, Carl Jung, took the exploration of inner space and time much further than had his mentor. Jung discovered complex structures in the unconscious, which he called archetypes. These corresponded to the demons and angels of another age. Jung's intelligence was inclusive and inquisitive, and his interest in the supernatural, in paranormal psychic experience, world mythology, Eastern spirituality, dreams, and world social and political events were all embraced by his comprehensive and deeply spiritual exegesis of the human psyche. He ended up providing through his psychology a bridge between the humanities and the sciences. Also connected and related in his work are the spiritual traditions of our species, our biology, and our traditions of Gnostic and occultic practice. Through his discoveries of the basic structures and dynamics of the psyche, which finally went far beyond Freud's, the magician energy that inspired this wise old man enabled us to understand ourselves in our modern context. For the first time in the modern age of scientific faith, we were able to reclaim the powers of the observing ego, to detach ourselves from our possessing complexes, to develop insulation for ourselves against the numinosity of the archetypes, while finding creative ways to access them. Several independent innovators and a host of schools of psychology have followed the lead of these two modern magicians. Among the most insightful and helpful psychological thinkers are Alice Miller, Heinz Kohut, and D.W. Winnicott, all psychoanalytic self-psychologists, and psychoanalyst Erik Erikson, who left to us his conception of the generative man. A renewed popular interest in the occult has accompanied the discoveries of these psychological thinkers. Beginning in the mid-19th century and accelerating up to the present moment, a general interest has been demonstrated in everything from astral projections to seances, tarot cards, to Zen. Many ordinary Westerners have begun to journey inward. Bankers, stockbrokers, insurance salespeople, and politicians have joined the Theosophists, the Neo-Pagans, the Scientologists, or other groups. A plethora of new religions have sprung up, along with support groups for every conceivable movement and circle. One of the hallmarks of these alternative psycho-religious organizations is an interest in and an appreciation, though practiced with differing levels of wisdom and sophistication, for sacred space and time, ritual elders, and the initiatory process. Mircea Eliade, a great scholar of comparative religion and mythology, pointed to initiation as the underlying dynamic of human life, the process that lends life meaning and dignity. Eliade believed there to be an absence of sacred space in modern life, and he attributed our modern malaise to this. We think he was wrong, that there is sacred space available to us, because it is a part of our archetypal wiring. Our problem is more in knowing what to do with it than in not having it at all. Although the leaders of many of these alternative groups and religions may have more in common with the sorcerer's apprentice than the sorcerer, still, these groups show some connection to the deep psychospiritual processes of the soul. This is a connection most establishment churches and synagogues have long lost since. In their attempts to come to terms with the prevalent worship of science and rationalism of the modern era, most establishment religions have lost their essential spirituality and purpose. This is why so many people have turned away from established religion and often toward occult movements. Modernity has left its acculturated citizens cut off from their psychological depths. Because of this, they are denied the wellspring of creative life. Modernity collapses all experience into one space-time dimension, ignores anything that cannot be apprehended by the five senses or the scientific instruments that extend them, and will not come to grips, despite all of the evidence amassed over the past 90 years, with the reality of the collective unconscious behind the ego. Modernity has reduced sacred space and time to a 2-week Caribbean cruise. Bar and bas mitzvahs and confirmation classes are the only remaining relics of our ancestral sacred rites of initiation. Dreams have been reduced to the electrochemical discharges of the sleep centers in the brain. With nothing but a material world to live in, modernity has made religions of consumerism and materialism. While our modern era is possessed by the magician as knower and technologist, his knowledge and his technologies are limited to material forms and material energies. As we'll see, the magician may always have a tendency to become schizoid and split himself off from the realm of deep feeling. We have seen modernity carry this tendency to its logical extreme, and we see the shadow magician's energy running wild. The threats of nuclear destruction, ecological devastation, and the mass extinctions of other species hang heavily over our heads. The power shadow of the magician, in his negative, manipulative, and destructive aspect, has unleashed forces he is unable to control. But we are moment by moment moving into a postmodern world, heralded by the rise of depth psychology, subatomic physics, and occult practices. There has begun a revaluing of the unseen world, a reappropriation of sacred time and space, a reconnection to the power of images and symbols, and a renewed commitment to the healing process. Spurred by sensitive and insightful popular books like Carlos Castaneda's studies of Yaqui Indian spirituality, there is a growing interest in the shaman. And as we've said, the shaman is the fullest expression of magician energy in human life. He signals new possibilities for achieving greater wholeness as individuals and as a species. With him present to locate and steward sacred time and space, perhaps we'll finally find a place where all shapes live together like one being.